All right, hello, Stillwater community. This is Pastor John, and welcome to the Eden Through Jesus Bible Study. Normally, this happens on Sunday nights, but there's been a lot going on since last Sunday. And so what we're going to do is we're going to record this one and post it tomorrow. Well, it'll be today when you watch this. For me, it's tomorrow. And so I'm excited about this. And if you have questions about stuff that we talk about, post it in the comments. And I will get back to you. So here's the thing about this Bible study. This is not really like our Sunday school classes, which are really geared for the entire church body. This class is specifically geared towards people who want to dig deeper in their personal Bible study. So it's not a beginner's class. I'm going to be assuming that you know a lot of things, and really we're jumping right into the middle of this Bible study. So if there are things that you don't know, I'd love to talk with you about them, and I can explain them to you. But this video really is, I'm just going to pick up like we haven't been I'm falling over, like we haven't been disrupted at all. I do want to remind everybody to please be paying attention to the information as it comes available on the news. Don't be gathering in groups of more than 10 people. Make sure you're washing your hands and wiping down your house as much as you're able to. Don't be just visiting lots of different people, but stick with people that are comfortable with you visiting. Don't just go visit your neighbors because you haven't seen them lately. So I want to make sure that you are loving everybody regardless of where they're from or what they look like or anything like that. God's church is global, and we need to be supporting each other during this time. And I want to make sure that you're safe while we do that. So we will be gathering on Sunday at 10:30. Please make sure, it would be great if you would post a picture of yourself gathering, even if it's just you and your coffee cup gathering. We want to be able to share those things together and make sure you're present with us if you can be. So that having been said, guys, I have a couple people here with me because it's weird to talk to an empty room. And so I'm going to teach you guys, and you guys will just follow along as though you were here the whole time. So I'm going to begin with a word of prayer, if that's okay with you guys. Lord, I'm stuttering already, and I fell off the seat, but I ask that you'd help me to calm down and to teach this in a way which is effective. Allow your church, God, the blessing of reading and understanding your word. Help me, God, to help with that, to be a vessel which your Spirit uses to teach. I know that I can't do it without you, Lord, and so I ask that you help me. Stand by us, Lord, as we read your word. For it's in the name of your Son we pray. Amen. So we started in Eden, and we moved from Eden all the way through the Abraham story. That's pretty much where we left off last week. And last week we introduced the idea of going down into Egypt. And that was a theme which I told you was going to come back into play in today's story. And today's story is the Exodus. It's the life of Moses. And so what I want to do at the beginning is just to refresh. What are the themes? What are the words that the authors were using to link together previous ideas from other stories? Because the authors do this quite a bit. They use analogy, they use a specific word or picture, and it's supposed to, in your head, make you think back to a previous story. The items which you ought to be looking for, obviously, when you see a garden someplace, in your head think, Garden of Eden. The ancient peoples connected gardens with their gods, with the idea of powerful kings and leaders. And the Bible connects it with the King of Kings, that God built his garden high on a mountain, and out of it poured all of the rivers of the world. And this place was where mankind began. So we're looking for trees, like the tree of knowledge of good and evil, like the tree of life. We're looking for rivers and wells. Abraham spent a lot of time by wells, and his whole life revolves around a tree at a place called Menorah, the oak of Menorah. And so we're reading the story, and we're interested to see, where do these elements pick back up? And why does God point them out in the story? So we're looking for wells, we're looking for trees, and trees often come into the story at a time of great decision, where there's a choice to be made between good and between evil, a choice between the tree of knowledge of good and evil and a choice for the tree of life. And this analogy really gets used in so many stories, especially in the wisdom literature. In the book of Proverbs, it says that wisdom is a tree of life. And so you're going to pick up lots of tree imagery in Moses' story. And remember that in Hebrew culture, the word for tree, eitz, covered more than just trees. It was pretty much anything that was wooden could be considered to be an eitz. Now, they had specific words for specific types of trees, but eitz was a giant, broad catch-all term, and it covered pretty much everything that you could think of. We also are looking for the number 7, because in the Bible, the number 7 deals with the concept of completeness, and it's become a picture of holiness, and it's used over and over and over again in connection with the kingdom of God and his rule on the earth. We also know to look for bricks. Once we were introduced to the idea of mankind building with bricks, things went south in a hurry. And the author made a big deal about the fact that they were building with bricks. And yet their culture collapsed as God scattered the Tower of Babel. So we're looking for bricks. We also know to look for family strife. Our brothers getting along. Our family members being loyal to each other. Or are they instead, like Cain and Abel, at each other's throats? And we've seen this really referenced in each of the stories. This one keeps coming back and will continue all the way through to Jesus when you have a guy called Judas who betrays his brother. Do you remember how he betrayed him? With a what? With a kiss. Yeah, with a kiss. The idea is he betrays his closest friend, his rabbi. We know to look also for the number 40. This one has come up a couple times, and it's connected to Noah releasing the raven. It's going to have a lot of mentions. It has to do with finding God's will, wandering a time of waiting in the wilderness as Noah was waiting for the flood waters to recede. And you probably already know where 40 is going to come into play with the Moses story. But it's not an accident. I think God wasn't just up in heaven thinking, and are they still wandering? I forgot if they're still down there. Tell them to stop. We're good now. That was enough. No, the idea is very specific. We also know, and this one's obvious, look for supernatural players. The book of Genesis is a supernatural book. Angels do things. They show up and say things. The Garden of Eden was defended by a cherubim who was there to keep mankind from going back into the garden. And we also know to look for Babel. Babel in the Bible has become a picture for the kingdom of evil. It's a rival to God's city of Jerusalem. And so Babel isn't always in Babylon. It's any place where man does that which is right in his own eyes. It's the kingdom of sin, if you wanted to think of it that way. And it's going to go all the way through the book of Revelation. You're going to find a lot of mentions about Babylon. And in Revelation, there's actually 2 cities called Babylon, so it gets super confusing. And you have to wonder, well, which Babylon? This is Mystery City Babylon. But if you don't know that this is a literature tool, that can be super confusing. And so you're thinking, no, it has to be exactly this city. Well, we know that Babel, which, by the way, is the same word as Babylon. In Hebrew, they're spelled exactly the same. Babel is more than just a city. It's the place, the bricks of this city, made by man to lift themselves up and to bring God down, became a sign of rebellion and the kingdom of sin. It's the world of false gods. You got the whole Deuteronomy 32 connection where God gives them over to their sin and says, if you want to worship false gods, fine, I give you up to their power, but I'm going to put in motion a rescue plan. And he called Abraham. So we see here the kingdom of violence. This is Babylon. And it's mankind's quest for an Eden of their own making. Can we bring heaven to earth in our own terms? And God came down and he scattered them. And then we get Abraham. Abraham lived in Ur. And we get this really great story of a man who was called out of the nations And God made him a little mobile Eden. Everywhere he went, good things happened to him. Not because Abraham was a good guy, and we kind of talked about some of the stories. Abraham would not have got Father of the Year, and it would have been okay if his wife forgot their anniversary, in my opinion. He was not a great husband. And so you read the story, and you got to wonder, God, why do you love Abraham? What's the point of this? Well, the point of it is that God would use fallen man to bring us back into his presence. The book of Exodus tells us that when the children of Israel are enslaved in Egypt, which is the new Babylon, it's the new place where they're building massive empires under the power of false gods. And it's supposed to connect in your head all the things that were bad about Babel are bad about Egypt. And the idea is that he enslaves the Israelites. And do you remember what their job was? Yeah, they were supposed to make bricks. It's not just like, do you think that was the only thing they did? It couldn't have been the only. So why point this out to me? It's done on purpose. It's not like whoever wrote this book, Moses or Aaron or whoever it was that was writing this, sat down and he was like, and what did we do in Egypt? We made bricks, and that is all. It's in there to link these two stories, to show you that the same God who scattered the nations at Babel is the God that drew his people out of the land of slavery in Egypt. To cover the beginning of the story is in my mind really interesting because it's a rescue story, and it links the stories of Noah and Babel into the Exodus story. This is what it says in Exodus chapter 2 verses 5 through 6. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the where? At the river." So that's one of our things that we look for. If people are around rivers, we wonder what's going to happen. There's usually an event which takes place. "And while her young women walked beside the river, she saw a basket made out of reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it, and when she opened it, she saw a child, and behold, the baby was crying, and she took pity on him, and said, 'This is one of the Hebrew children, who Pharaoh had tried to murder.'" She knows exactly who this is. This is one of the Hebrew children, and he has come to me down the river. In her mind, this is an unusual event. How often do you see babies floating down the river in little baskets? It's unusual. In her head, she would have connected this with there's something special about this baby. All the others, maybe, but I'm going to rescue this one. And of all the women in all of the stretches of Nile River to pick her up, it's the princess of Egypt. This is the hand of providence at work. But there's also a couple interesting connections which you might miss when you read through this story. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14, it says, "Go and make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch." When Moses' mom makes her baby's little ark, she does exactly the same thing, and the same words are used. This is the same God who took Noah through the flood, also brought Moses down the Nile. These words are there in your head to link the stories, so that you think to yourself, God is so good. And if God protected Noah, God's going to protect this baby too. Well, Moses turns out to be, I'm just going to tell you, he was a little violent. He grows up, I wouldn't say with a chip on his shoulder, but he grows up with a mean streak in him. Obviously, he was probably teased pretty badly growing up as a foreigner in Pharaoh's court. I don't think he was best buddies with Pharaoh like they make out in like the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments movie, but I do like that movie. It's fun, but it does take some liberties with this. But Moses is watching what's happening, and he looks out one day, and he begins to realize that his people are not being treated well by other people. Here you have family strife. All the nations of the world were intended to live together in peace. But they've enslaved the Israelites. They forced them into labor to make bricks. And it burns Moses up until one day he can't take it anymore. And what does it do? He says in verse 11 of chapter 2, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way, and he looked that way, and he murdered him and hid his body in the sand. If this doesn't ring a bell with you with Cain and Abel, it should. What did Cain do with Abel? Jesus, or God rather, says, the blood of your brother does what? It cries out to me from the ground. Moses tries to do this himself. In a very real way, he is standing in front of the trees to choose violence or to choose another path. Well, the scripture is pretty clear that your sins will find you out. And Moses doesn't get away with this crime. Actually, the guy that he rescues turns and runs his mouth. And Moses gets scared and realizes if even the guy that I rescued is being like that to me, I got to go. I got to get out of here. And so he flees from Egypt.
He's like a man with no country.
Pam says he's like a man with no country.
Nobody accepts him.
Yeah, he doesn't fit anywhere. What other person have we talked about who was like this? Called out of the nations to be a blessing to all of the nations. This is Abraham like. He's out in the wilderness. He doesn't know where he's going. And you read the story, it's pretty interesting. Look at what happens next. I titled this slide Murder and Marriage, not because they're the same thing, but because they happen in quick succession in Moses' life. In chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a what? By a well. Here again, this is one of those things which we are taught to stop and look. Because a well is a place where water springs up out of the earth. And the ancient peoples connected that as a picture of God's grace. God's goodness, that in the midst of all the desert, here God is blessing. I think I would feel that way if I was wandering in the desert and I found an oasis. I would stop and give God thanks. We know from the story of Abraham that Abraham was often by wells. He dug wells. You remember the story where he plants a tree and it offers 7 lambs as a picture of the peace between the nations and himself? Beautiful story, but loaded with these symbols. And it's important for us to look for him. So here he is, he's by a well. And who should come along but a bunch of angry, violent men? Now you would think these are Moses' people. He's an angry, violent guy. He doesn't have a place to hang out. He doesn't have a tribe. He doesn't have a gang. He doesn't have a family. And these men come to the well. It says the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And they came and drew water and filled the troughs of their water's flock. But the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them. I like this line. It's going to be important later in Moses' story. And I want you to remember how it's phrased here. He stood up and saved them and brought water to the flock. Craig's wheels are already spinning over here. You can see it a little bit maybe. This is it. Now, how many daughters does the priest of Midian have? I'm just saying. That's unusual. And they're all out there together. And so Moses, this is a good turn of events. He trades in a bunch of angry, violent guys for 7 beautiful, wealthy women. And he thinks to himself, I have really come up in the world. And they think he is just the best thing ever because he rescued. This is the whole knight in shining armor thing, except I don't know that they'd invented much armor yet, and definitely not knights. And so he's a classy guy. He grew up in the courts of Egypt. I bet he's got some cool stories. He's been lots of places. He's on the run. He's got that bad boy image, maybe. And one of these girls really loves her Moses. And it says that they get married. You're going to find here the choice between the trees again by the well. Moses can choose either to defend the weak or to oppress them. Either to serve and to go the easy path, or to stand up against the violent and bring peace. Jesus taught us, blessed are the what? Peacemakers. That's what Moses does here. He uses that strength that he has finally for a good purpose. This is a turning point in the Moses story. We're going to leave the well and the pretty ladies behind. And suddenly Moses' story is going to hit fast forward. We find that he is called to a mountain. This is something which we have been taught to look for. God oftentimes reveals himself on mountains. The ancient peoples believed that mountains were a place where the heavens and the earth touched. It was a picture to them of a wonderful place to build a temple or an altar. Even the pagans were doing this, or they were building their own man-made altars. And so I want to read to you what it says in Exodus 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. So what is Moses' job? He's a shepherd. He's a shepherd on the mountain of the Lord. This ought to ring a bell, but you're thinking the wrong direction. You're probably thinking Jesus. You should be thinking Abel at this point. What did Abel do? What was his job? He was a keeper of sheep. He was a keeper of sheep. And where did he do it? Outside the gates of Eden on the mountain of the Lord. Abel gives his life. He's a righteous man. So far, though, Moses isn't all that righteous. He's a murderer, as a matter of fact. He does, finally do something good here, but you wouldn't associate him with a perfect person like Abel. But here he is. He's a shepherd. He is on his way. It says he led them to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord, this is pre-incarnate Jesus. That's who we're talking about here. The angel of the Lord, God himself, speaks, appears to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses, do not come near. Take the sandals from off your feet, for the ground on which you are standing is what? Holy ground. Moses, on the slopes of the mountain of God, sees a tree consumed with light. And in the tree is a supernatural being. Does this not sound an awful lot like Eden? Except there it wasn't a tree of light, it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it wasn't the angel of the Lord, it was the Satan who spoke and deceived. Here, God has flip-flopped the story. This is an opportunity for the children of Adam to redeem themselves, to do it right. They're literally, or he is rather, standing in front of the tree. I thought it was a bush. It's the same thing. Sinah here, because it's on Mount Sinai. It's a great word to use here. It's clever. But it's a thing made of wood. It ought to remind you back to the Abraham story, where what is caught in the bush? A ram, right? Here it's not a ram, but it's the Lamb of God. And there's going to be tremendously beautiful things done with that image by the New Testament authors as soon as we cross into the New Testament. So he sees a supernatural being in its branches, and suddenly he's having a conversation with the Lord. Long story short, God tells Moses, go back to Egypt and you tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses says, that is a terrible idea. And God says, I didn't ask you if it was a terrible idea. I told you to do it. And they have this long conversation in which Moses more or less refuses to do it. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to do it. Here are the 50 reasons why I won't do it. And so you've got to wonder at the patience of the Lord. He set up this scene. He grew his little bush, right? He's lit it on fire. It's not being consumed. He comes down himself to speak to Moses, and Moses says, I'm going to pass. God is able to overcome Moses' objections, however. And something really interesting is given. God defines to Moses what the job is. What is it that you are going to be asked to do? And here many American readers struggle because we want to think of this as a purely earthly story, when in reality, the Bible so far has been describing both the physical and the supernatural world as overlapping. God is going to judge physical Egypt, but he is also going to judge spiritual Babylon. There are two verses I want you to see, one in Exodus and one in Numbers. Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 through 14 says, For I, this is God speaking, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. Well, that's weird, isn't it? You know, we're used to thinking, for sure, God, you get those firstborn, the Egyptians. I'm a little upset about the animals, though. That seems unfair. And I don't even know what you're talking about with the gods. Aren't those just imaginary? What he is talking about here are the supernatural beings that are behind the deception that is Egypt. Satan is a deceiver. He wants to be worshipped. You can see this in the story of Jesus on the mountain. I will give you all these things if you'll just bow down and worship me. The powers of darkness have set themselves up a nice little thing in Egypt. People are praying to them. They've invented their own names. They've got their own temples. They're liking this. And God says, I'm going to come and I'm going to bring judgment on everybody. You who thought you dwelt in safety in Egypt, be aware, God is on his way. Look at what it says in Numbers 33, verse 4. On their gods also I will execute judgments. This is not just physical. This is a war in heaven and on earth. Now, that having been said, God is really good at winning. You know that, right? It's not as though God was like, whoo, barely got through that one. Those Egyptian demons down there, they are tough stuff. Look, God rolls through this place and he destroys his enemies. And he looks fantastic doing it. So what happens next is this list of plagues. And we're used to thinking of the plagues as nice little children's stories, right? I taught them for VBS this last year. And then I did it up at Covington too. I had a lot of fun with this. And I had the kids all like croaking like frogs and hopping around. And for most people, this is a kid's story. An ancient reader would have been keyed into something which you maybe aren't. And that's the names and jobs of the Egyptian, names and jobs of the Egyptian deities. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the plagues, and we're going to do this fairly quickly. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the Egyptian gods, and I'm going to describe to them and then read to you in the scriptures so that you can see what happened. So Moses goes to see Pharaoh. He tells Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I'm not going to do that. So God gave Moses a way to show Pharaoh that he was for real. He said, take your staff, which is made of what? Wood. Tree. Take this mobile tree with you, and when you walk into the presence of Pharaoh, throw it down on the ground and it will become a serpent. This is an important symbol in Egypt. The magicians of Pharaoh, they do the same thing, but lo and behold, if their serpents aren't devoured by God's, it's a picture right away. God is going to destroy you. He's going to win. He's going to bring about the freedom of his people, and no one is going to stop him. It makes me think of Psalm 40, where it talks about, don't you know, haven't you heard that the same God, the everlasting, is Lord of everything? The idea here is Moses is in a good place because he rests in the hands of God. The Pharaoh had one job in Egypt. This is something which sounds really weird to us because we think of Pharaoh as just being like the king. The ancient peoples did not think of Pharaoh as just a king. They thought of him as an earthly god. And his job was to do one thing. Maintain something called ma'at. Ma'at means balance between good and evil, right and wrong. That's what he does. So if the rivers don't flood and give them nice farmland, whose fault is that? Pharaoh's. Bad storms blow through, whose fault is that? Pharaoh's. Pharaoh was supposed to be the go-between between the gods and mankind. And so when Egypt falls apart, guess who they're grouchy with? With Pharaoh, yeah. Pharaoh's supposed to stand between the gods and the people. And suddenly Pharaoh is revealed to be just a man. And some nobody called out of the wilderness is lifted up. By the way, do you know the name of the Pharaoh in the Exodus? Oh, that's, you watched the movie. Yeah. It doesn't say. Do you know why? It's the ultimate slam. His name doesn't get recorded. How important are you if you don't even get named? Your job here is lose. That's what I want you to do. I want you to stand there, look grouchy, and just lose every single time. That's what Pharaoh does. Everything that happens. Moses' name we remember. The name of Aaron we remember. Even Miriam we remember. We remember lots of people's names. But Pharaoh, who was the most important person in an earthly standpoint, was the least important in the eyes of God. Because he was against God. He was a Gibborim, a man-killer. The descendant of people who had butchered and killed children. This is not a good man. And this little strip of kingdom following the Nile is not really Eden. Even though they've built their own mountains and dug their own wells, God is going to break them and scatter them just like he did every other time in the story so far. Exodus 7:20 says, Moses lifted up his staff, struck the Nile. I think that's kind of funny. He took his staff and he just beats it. Bam! And all of a sudden the river starts bleeding as though he had struck it with a sword. And it began to pour out blood until the Nile itself is all blood. Do you know what the Egyptians seeing that would have thought? Dude, you messed up our river. Where are we going to fish now, right? That's not what they thought. Because to them, the Nile was a god. Our God has been struck a blow and is bleeding. There is an Egyptian god called Hapi. And her job is to make sure the Nile does its thing. When the Niles flood, Hapi is happy. Hapi is happy. That sounds good. I like it. Let me read you. This is an Egyptian hymn to Hapi. It says, Homage to thee, O Hapi. Thou appearest in this land, and thou comest in peace to make Egypt to live. Thou art the hidden one and the guide of the darkness on the day when it is thy pleasure to lead the same. Thou art the waterer of the fields in which Ra has created. Thou givest life to all animals. Thou makest all the land to drink unceasingly as thou descendest thy way out of heaven. Where did they see this river as coming from? From the gods. And suddenly, you broke it. This is bad news, real bad news. And then it says on verse 25, by the way, I got that. It's from Myths and Legends of Ancient Egypt, page 171 from Spence. And I haven't looked it up a whole lot, but I did think that the imagery there was interesting because it highlights the idea of the rivers being connected to the heavens. But how long after the striking of the river until Moses carries on the next phase of his plan? 7 days. Here again, if we're connecting God doing something new, and actually in the Egypt story, you kind of get the idea God is uncreating Egypt. All the things that he kind of does in Genesis 1 and 2, he seems to be undoing them here. The guys in Egypt are freaking out. There was no more important thing than the Nile River. Did you have a thought?
Yeah, between each plague and like this being a plague, did they clear up? Do we know?
I think some of them actually overlap. I don't think they all clear up. For instance, the boils, I doubt very seriously they were like, well, it's been a couple days, my boils are all gone. And so, no, I don't think so. I think the frogs probably had a good time when all the flies showed up. I think they would have enjoyed that. And so you are going to find that they overlap, but it does not say every time how long they lasted. For instance, the darkness doesn't last the whole time. People have been to Egypt since it's sunny there. We know this is not ongoing. Exodus 8. I'm going to move kind of quickly through this. You've heard the plagues. I just want you to see the connection to their gods. Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs leapt up out of the water. They covered the land of Egypt, but the magicians did the same by their secret arts, and they made frogs that come up and cover the land of Egypt. That's very unhelpful. It's incredibly unhelpful. So they go, and by the way, there is an Egyptian god. Her name is Heket. She's a goddess of fertility and of magic, and she's often depicted with a frog's head. Because they thought frogs were pretty neat creatures. They live in two worlds. They're in the water and they're on the land. There aren't a whole lot of things that do that. And if you watch their transformation from tadpole into like bullfrog, it's pretty impressive. So the Egyptians thought more highly of frogs than you do. Kermit's a nice guy, but he's probably as high as any of the frogs have climbed on the social ladder that I know of. But here he says, look, the Egyptian magicians, they say, well, break the power of Moses. And with all their secret arts, all that the powers of darkness are capable of doing is breaking it further. This is what they do. They don't bring healing, they bring destruction. There has never been a single virtue invented by hell ever. All that he can offer is the twisting of a virtue, the breaking of something which God has already made. And you're going to see the magicians and you're going to wonder, like, why you guys are not helping the situation. Now I have more frogs to cope with. The next plague is actually a set of two of them. It says that, this is, I think, really kind of interesting. He takes a bunch of dust out of a pot and he kind of throws it up in the air, blows it up in the air, and it says that the dust becomes gnats, flies, and flies all over the place. And then it says... there's a couple things along the same lines, but I want to point out something to you. In ancient Egypt, have you ever noticed something about the pictures of their priests? What do you notice about these two guys? They're bald as a cue ball. Ancient Egyptian priests shaved themselves from head to toe all the time. They did not have hair on their body because if you had bugs living in your hair, or you were not ritually washed, you could not go into the temples and serve the gods. These two plagues, the next two plagues, make it impossible for the priests to do their job. Suddenly, the gods have lost their magicians. You don't see these guys doing much after this. You might wonder what happened to them. Well, they went home and suffered like everybody else. They couldn't go back and work their magic in the temples because they had become unclean. The lice were in their house just like everywhere else. They were not able to continue in the role that they had meant to. Look at chapter 9, verse 6. The next day, the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not the livestock of the people of Israel. One of the interesting things that you'll find about Egyptian archaeology is that one of the things they dig up every so often is cows. Mummified cows. There was a cult of something called the Apis bull and a goddess called Hathor. We know a lot about this. It's all in their drawings. They viewed this as a god of power, of strength. And suddenly, even the cattle in the fields are dying. All the livestock died. It's connected to Hathor, who typically has bull's horns on her head. This is even Hathor is unable to stop the power of the God of Moses. Next thing you find is that boils are breaking out all over people. The goddess Sekhmet was supposed to keep you healthy and fight off problems when they came into your life. She had a lion's face. She's a very scary looking lady. But if everyone's got boils, guess who's not doing her job? Or the job she told everyone, or that they thought she was doing. Next thing you find in verse 23. Yeah, go ahead.
What was her name again?
Her name is Sekhmet. The usual spelling. Yeah. Exodus 9, 23 through 24 says this. Moses stretched out what? There's your staff again. He holds his staff up. This time he doesn't beat the river. What does he do with it?
Towards heaven.
He strikes the heavens. He points it up into the skies. And the Lord sent thunder and hail down to the earth. If you were an Egyptian and your priests had all quit, and the Nile had turned to blood, and the cows had all died, and boils had struck your body, you would assume, I wonder who's winning this heavenly battle. The gods of Egypt or the God of Moses? Well, things don't seem to be going well for the home team, if you follow me. They're worried about this, and then what happens? It sounds like the sky is falling apart. They would have been terrified of this. Much more so than you would be of just a storm. They would have seen this as a supernatural sign. There was a goddess called Nut. It looks like nut, but I think it's pronounced Nut. And she was the sky. And so if the battle has now stretched into to her domain, it tells later on that Moses stretched his staff over the land, and the wind blows in locusts out of the wilderness, where there was a god called Set. He's the bad guy typically in this stuff. He wasn't supposed to get into Egypt. He was supposed to stay on the outs, but he seems to have lost his job too. The Egyptian gods are fallen left and right. They don't know who to pray to. They don't know who to talk to. It says, all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left, not a green thing remained. So Egypt has become an ungarden. Its river has ceased to be a river. Its gods have ceased to be powers. Its safety is broken. Everything here points to the power of God. The ninth plague is perhaps the most frightening to the Egyptian way of thinking. Remember, there's a fight in the heavens. Hail is falling, thunder and lightning are flashing. The next thing that happens, the chief god of the Egyptians' name is Ra, or one of the chief gods. He is the sun. The sun lives in the sky. It rolls across the sky, they believed. And after the heavenly thunderstorm and the battle that they thought must have been taking place up there, the sun went out. If they weren't ready to lose their marbles before, they're ready now. Ra has been destroyed, defeated. Darkness covers the ungarden of Egypt. Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land, a darkness that you can feel. That's intense. I love this line. It's an intense feeling. How long does it last?
3 days.
Take a note of that. Remember that with the Jesus story when we celebrate Easter a little bit here. The sun will rise again, except that time it's not Ra. It's the real sun. It's Jesus. And so these stories, they all interconnect, but you have to kind of pick up the little pieces that are being put down. The last of the gods here that's attacked is Pharaoh himself. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn, where it says the Lord struck down the firstborn of Egypt. They believed that Pharaoh was a god. It was his job to protect the people. There was another goddess called Isis, and she was the god that protected children. This is like the dream team of Egyptian deities. And they're knocked off one by one. An ancient reader would have known who these people were. To us, they're just characters from storybooks. Moses grew up seeing the worship of these gods. It would be in our world as though there was something done which caused the world to realize that Muhammad was not really a prophet, or something along those lines, a real religion. But to us, these are kind of fables because they lived so long ago that we forget the connections between them. But this was world-shattering for Moses' world. So God tells Pharaoh, let my people go. Finally, after this last plague, what happens? I let you go. But he's very bad at letting the people go. Yeah, he changes his mind. He gets his boys together. They get their chariots and they roll after Moses. Chapter 13, verses 21 through 22 says this. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they may travel by day and by night. And the pillar of the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. They're literally seeing their God. Where is Heket? Where is Ra? Where are the gods of the wealthy and the powerful? Nowhere. But Moses is following the Shekinah glory, a visible manifestation of the presence of God. Pharaoh chases him all the way to the sea. Red Sea, Reed Sea, we're not going to argue about that today. All the way there. Moses gets there and realizes there's no bridge, which you wouldn't expect. No way to get across, and the people turn on Moses, which I think is strange, because they can literally see their God right in front of them. They have lived through these plagues, and he has destroyed every god which stood against them. Here comes Pharaoh with his army, literally a pagan god, man in the flesh, false god, not really, huge ego problem. And they're terrified. So what happens is God moves between them. The Shekinah glory moves between the armies of Egypt and the people of Israel, like a shepherd would do. Here again we see the images again that go all the way back to the gates of Eden. The protection of the weak. Moses is told in chapter 14 and verse 16, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the people of Israel may go on dry ground. Oh, is that all I have to do? Yeah. Hold this bit of tree out over the water, and I will save you. I will rescue you. Verse 19 of chapter 14 says this: The angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. A pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was a cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Imagine a black thundercloud lit up with lightning inside. Fire and light. You thought the bush on fire was amazing. This is a tree of cloud. I mean, it's huge. And so the Egyptians quite wisely decide, let's not go through that. Let's wait till it moves, and then we'll go. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind, and all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Do you remember in Genesis where it says the Spirit or the breath of God hovered over the face of the waters, and he pulled out of the waters dry land? It's interesting, isn't it, that you seem to have a replay of the same words. What are you supposed to think there? Well, the same God that did it before will do it again. The same God who brought order out of chaos, which was supposed to be Pharaoh's job, but he can't do it. He's just a man. God is God, not Pharaoh. Suddenly the seas are divided, and a path through the seas is seen. And Moses, when he gets to the other side, he breaks into song, because it's obviously a Disney movie. And you have to have a good song number every once in a while. Everyone is singing. It's called the Song of Moses. But look here at what it says. It says, who is like you, O Lord, among who? Among the gods. Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, and doing wonders? Moses saw his God as having demonstrated that no power in heaven or on earth was like him. I think of the time in the New Testament when Jesus was on the boat and the storms came and the disciples cried out, "Don't you care that we're going to die?" And he calms the sea by just telling it to. Another time, Peter jumps out of the boat, right? And he's walking on the water because he sees Jesus doing it. And Jesus says, sure, you want to walk on the water? Come to me. I can do this all day. I'm really good at water stuff. Because this is what he's done over and over again. But Peter begins to sink when? When he pulls his eyes off of the Lord. And Jesus tells him, he says, why did you doubt? And in Jesus' mind, he's remembering the times that he's already done this. The gospel authors, by linking these stories like that, meant for you to remember Exodus. They meant for these stories to blend in your mind together. So everyone is across the sea. Do you want to know what happened to Pharaoh? You already do. I'm trying to follow Moses here. And I'm really trying to follow the tree stuff, the Edenic imagery through the Bible. You're able to get the rest of the story on your own. They just came through the sea. God has protected them. Everything is great. Everything is awesome, like the Lego song. And everything is great. And they're going along, and they're realizing pretty quick, there's no water out here in the desert. It's one thing to have water for, I don't know, you. Trying to provide water for however many Israelites there were, massive job. There are dads and moms here who are freaking out because they cannot get water for their kids until suddenly they see there's an oasis. Oh, I'm so excited about this. They get up to the oasis and they realize that the water in this oasis would kill a man if he drank it. It tastes terrible. It's going to make you violently sick. This is a false oasis. a false Eden. Didn't we just leave one of those? Yeah, we did. We absolutely did. And so this is what happens. I want to read it to you. It says, when they came to Menorah, which is a really creative name. That's sarcasm.
Oh, so that's not the same word.
No, different one. Different. It means bitter. They found a place and they said, this water is bitter. Let's call it bitter. It's a great name. It's like New England or something really creative like that. So it says, they came to Menorah, and they could not drink the water of Menorah because it was bitter. Therefore they named it Menorah. And the people grumbled against who? Against Moses. And they said, what are we to drink? This is your fault, is pretty much what they're saying. You brought us to a false Eden. Were they following Moses or were they following the cloud? You get the idea they're following Moses, and Moses is following the cloud. If they had seen all the stuff that they've seen, they should have had faith. If there's one thing that their God is really good at, it's water stuff. They shouldn't have had any doubt about this. They should have been like, hey, Abraham, Moses, go ask God to take care of this for us. But they don't. They're upset about it, and so God has a plan. This is what he tells him to do. The Lord showed him a log, and he threw it in the water, and the water became what? What is a log? It's a chunk of tree. What's the image here? Are you seeing this? The trees again. Where does salvation come from? From God. Not from doing it your own way, not from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but from the tree of life, which perhaps we glimpse on Mount Sinai, where Jesus appears to Moses in the burning bush. Suddenly, this tree imagery is there again. And we talked about how Jesus would one day hang on a tree and turn all of our sin into his righteousness. The imagery here is just so thick and so deep that you have to sit back and be like, that was really clever, God. You took them to the one place where you knew the water was bad, so you could teach them this. But if you don't look for the trees, if you're not paying attention to the symbolism here, you're going to miss this. Colleen, you look like you've got a thought.
I'm just really trying to process that thought.
Okay. Is there something I can do to help with it?
I don't know. I'm lost.
Okay, let me try to back it up. So they go out into the wilderness, and they find there is a pond of water, an oasis. The water cannot be drunk. It's bitter, it's nasty. It's a false Eden. How do you fix the world? How do you fix this false Eden? Through the tree. God said, take this tree, throw it in the water, and I will fix it. How were our sins forgiven? Through Christ on the tree. You see the connection is here. It's not saying Moses was just really sneaky and really good at magic. The glory goes to God by linking it to the idea that and it's not even a proper tree, it's a log. What does anyone's translation say? Branch? It says log. It's not a whole tree, it's part of a tree. But the idea here is, this is strange. Moses' staff has done this. Now we've seen a burning bush. We saw a bush on the mountain where the ram was held. We saw the ark itself turned into an altar. We've seen some really fantastic things that all center around this imagery of trees. And then in the Psalms, it tells us that we're supposed to be like trees.
Mine does say a tree.
Yours says a tree? The imagery is there, but it's one of those things that the American reader likes to run past. Because to us, we file that away under trivial. I don't want to know. I don't care what it was. I care about the miracle. I don't care about how the miracle was brought about, when that's the most important thing. The power of God. That is the way that he chose to act. Okay. He brings them through Menorah on their way to where? Where are they going? You guys know the story. They're going to Sinai. They're going to Mount Sinai, the mountain of the Lord. This is what it says in Exodus 19, chapter 17 through 20. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. Okay, big day. This is important. Sorry we doubted you back there at the stinky water hole. And sorry we doubted and tried to, upset Moses. You're going to meet your God. Now, haven't they been following him the whole time? You get the idea they've been keeping their distance. That's about to change. It says next, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. In their hundreds and their thousands, they stood looking up the hill. You remember back when we talked about Cain and Abel being cast out of the garden and how they kept moving farther and farther away? At this point, the people of Israel turn around and look back. It's visual. They realize God is up there and I am not ready to talk to him. I need some help if I'm going to talk to him. And they should have been thinking about the pool of water they just saw. How did the water become fit for people? Through the log that was thrown in, through the tree. How will they be ready to stand before God? It's going to take the power of God. This happens with Isaiah in Isaiah 6. He says, "Woe is me, I'm a dead man. I've seen the Lord of hosts." And an angel brings a coal off the altar and touches his lips. There's that fire element again. It says, listen to this, it says, the Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. And smoke went up of it like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly, and the sound of the trumpets grew louder and louder. This is not normal. They're hearing heaven. Remember, that's what Eden was. The place where heaven and earth overlapped. But God told Adam and Eve, you can't stay in Eden. Why? Sin. You got to go. Now they're looking back and realizing it's actually scary to think about going back. To stand in God's presence. Moses, it says, spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top, and Moses went up. Can you visualize that in your head? Is that not intense? The power, the thunder, the fire, and God calls Moses, and Moses says, yeah, I'm on my way. Up the hill. Who goes with him? Nobody. And that's a good idea. Yeah, they are seeing God. By the way, did you catch the part where it says, and God came down? Did you catch that? Does that remind you of Babel?
And in 16,
It talks about the third day again.
Yes.
and then it talks about God coming down.
Look, I'm skipping tons of amazing stuff, okay? I'm already, I think, about an hour into this. I may split this into 2 videos. I'd make you no promises. This whole story is dripping with this stuff. That's why, Colleen, it's important, and I'm trying to point them out. Not so that I can point all of them out, but so that when you read them, you can spot them on your own. And you say, oh, well, that's interesting. Another 3 here. And then God came down. Like at Babel, he came down and he scattered the nations, right? But here he comes down to be with the nation of Israel. It's an opposite. Here there's healing instead of cursing. It depends on the heart of man. And that reminds me of the Cain and Abel story. Remember, God came down and talked to Cain? And he was cursed mostly because his heart was all twisted. If you seek me, you will find me if you search for me with your whole heart. I'll fix what's wrong. God used the log to fix the pond. Here he uses the cross to fix our hearts. David said this, "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me." He knew that it wasn't about him doing something to make himself righteous. It was about allowing God the power to act in his life. Look at chapter 20, verses 18 through 21. All the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain was smoking, and the people were afraid, and they trembled, and they stood far off, and they more or less say, "Moses, you go up there, we'll stay down here. You go up there, we're not going." The people, it says, stood afar off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Sometimes we associate God only with light. Here he's associated as having cloaked himself in darkness. There's a separation that's present at Sinai. It's the effects of sin. And it's going to be made abundantly clear as we keep on chucking, or is that a word? Yeah, as we keep moving through the story. So they're moving on from Sinai. I'm going to skip a bunch of things. They're still there. In the camp, God is talking to them, and he says, "Listen, I'm going to send an angel before you." The same angel who's speaking out of the bush. And it says, "I will put my name in him to bear the name of God." This is pre-incarnate Jesus. God is literally with them. Miracles all over the place. Power demonstrated on a daily basis. And that's not the end of it. God continues to pour out more blessing. It says that Moses grabs the elders of Israel, 70 of them. By the way, that's an important number. 70 of the elders. And he says, "Hey guys, let's go up the mountain. God wants to meet with you." And it says they go up. Excuse me. That's not a coronavirus cough. That's just normal cough. They go up the mountain and they see God on a throne up there, and their jaws just hit the floor. They're like, "Oh my goodness, this is a place of marvels and wonders because God is here." It's a replay of what we had lost. But the heart of man is so fallen that the things which should inspire beauty and love and devotion fill us with terror. That's why angels, every time they show up, what's their line? "Fear not." Why? "Because I'm terrifying to you." The idea here is, look, they show up and it says they eat and drink in the presence of God. They have a meal with him. Where did that come from? God provides. Yeah, this is interesting stuff here. God is taking care of his people. The next verse here, we're going to look at it. It says, listen, "The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the 7th day, Moses comes out of the clouds." How many days is that? 7 again. We're picking up these references. Moses, it says the next verse, is verse 18. "Moses entered the cloud, went up the mountain, and Moses is up on the mountain for how long?"
40 days.
This again, the same numbers are repeated. God is purposefully showing you that I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. When Moses is up on the mountain, God gives him instructions about stuff that he wants done. Build a tabernacle. And a huge part of the book of Exodus is the building of the tabernacle. And he tells him to build this really beautiful tent and to decorate it like a garden with rich, vibrant colors and the skins of animals, and to cover the walls and decorations. And one of the most important things that they put in there is called the tree of light, the Menorah. Listen to how it describes it. "You shall make a lampstand of pure gold." Ooh, I like that. "The lampstand shall be a hammered work. Its base and its stem and its cups and its calyxes and its," what's that word? "Flowers shall be of one piece with it. And there shall be 6 what? Branches going out of its side. 3 branches of the lampstand out of one, and the 3 branches of the lampstand out of the other side of it. 3 cups, and make them look like almond blossoms. And he goes on and he's describing more and more. But the more you read this description, God says, build me a lampstand that looks like a tree. And not just any tree, but a tree that pulsates light. If that doesn't have burning bush stuff written all over it, I don't know what does. It's supposed to remind you of the tree. It says, see that you make them after the pattern which was being shown to you on the mountain. Do you remember the poem, the promise that God made to Abraham? It's called the Abrahamic Covenant. How it was 7 lines of poetry. This is a pattern which God uses. This actually is a picture of, you can't see that very well at all. That's disappointing. This is the altarpiece or like a pulpit stand in the city of Magdala, like Mary Magdalene, where she was from. This is one of the only ones that's been discovered from Jesus' time. And on the front of it, they carved the menorah. And on either side of it, they put olive oil jars. And on the top of it, they put almond blossoms. The temple was a garden to them. It was a place where God dwelt. Later on in the book of Numbers, it says, this is Numbers 8, 1 through 4. They're talking about it and it says, from its base to its flowers, it was hammered work according to the pattern that the Lord had shown to Moses. The symbols that God chose to use are echoed in the pages of the stories. It wasn't just something to be seen, it's also something to be read. And you'll see them in the stories, and you'll see them in the descriptions of what they built. So Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days, right? Apparently it's 1 day too long. Because the children of Israel are flipping out. And they're thinking to themselves, this is intimidating. I don't like this at all. The God that's up on the mountain is terrifying to me. And they go to Aaron and they say, up, make us gods. And you think to yourself, what? Why? What in the world? They say, make us an idol. In the ancient world, they did not believe that those statues were actually their gods. They were a vessel for their God to inhabit. Does that make sense to you? What the Israelites seem to have been trying to do here was to build a house for God and to build it in the shape of a young bull, like the pagan Egyptian symbols that they had left behind. It was a common expression at times for someone who built an idol. The craftsman would say, I didn't build that idol. I just put my hands in the fire and it came out. No one believed it, but it was something that you said. Aaron says the same thing here. What the Israelites are trying to do in this story is to put God in a more comfortable box for them to experience him. Because the mountain is freaking them right out. They're terrified of this. They want to control God. This has happened before. And it went very badly then, and it's going to go very badly this time. We call this episode that of the golden calf. We know this. It says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And Aaron saw this, and he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation. He says, tomorrow shall be a feast day to the who? To the Lord. They called it the name of God. They seem to be trying to redo what God is doing in their own way. This is exactly what got them in trouble in Eden. I'm going to substitute what I think is right and wrong for what God says is right and wrong. This is the tree again. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's an allegory for temptation. Now, it actually happened for Adam and Eve, but for us, we look at that and we say, that's exactly right. I have to choose to do right or to do wrong. The Apostle James said this, he that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is what? Sin. The whole thing is the same thing. These guys are trying to make God agree with them instead of the other way around. By the way, this still happens today. Are there people, instead of trying to read their Bible and understand it, they read their Bible to try to find something that agrees with them? All the time this happens. This is a danger. We've got to protect ourselves from it. And so even in the golden calf story, you should recognize that there's Edenic imagery going on. Why do you think they picked a calf? For those of you at home, we're now enduring awkward silence. Why do you think he chose a calf?
Well, the Egyptians held them up high.
Yeah, remember the Apis bulls? This was something that was really popular for them. Also, do you ever try to move a cow? If they don't want to go, you tip them over. You're a terrible person. They don't tip. I'll tell you what, man, a cow, especially like a young bull, is strong. He's his own guy. He's going to do what he likes. There's a strength and power there. And so I think in their minds they were trying to do something good, but the whole point was they're ignoring God. They're leaving God all the way out of it and trying to make God something they were more comfortable with. That's really upsetting to God. Moses comes down the mountain. This is important. Realizes, boy, this is bad. You guys are worshiping a golden cow, and the mountain is still on fire. We heard trumpets the other day. I don't know who is blowing the trumpets, but there's people up there. It's intimidating. We just saw God on his throne, high and lifted up, and he gave us snacks, and we ate in front of the throne. And here you guys have made a cow, and Aaron, my own brother, got carried away in this. Look at the end of this phrase. It says, they made for themselves gods of gold, but now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Moses goes up the mountain here. Look at the beginning of the verse. It says, Moses says, you have sinned a great sin. Now I will go up to the Lord, and perhaps I can make atonement for what you've done. Do you understand what he's saying? He says, I'm going to go up the mountain, and I'm probably not going to come back down the mountain. I'm going to go up and offer to die in your place. That's what Moses does here. That a man would lead his people, offer his life up for their salvation, ought to be ringing all kinds of New Testament bells in your head as you think, wow, isn't that like Jesus? By the way, the Bible tells us that they were supposed to be looking for another prophet like Moses. I think that's what this is talking about. Not another prophet who would do plagues, but another prophet who would bring healing to the people. Plagues God does those all the time, He's got the boils. God had no problem with that. But to find a man who was willing to lay down his life for another, that's the greatest kind of love that there is. This piece of Scripture right here is the height of Moses at his finest. He's come a long way from that violent man at the well who murdered an Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. Now he is a deliverer, willing to die for his people. God, by the way, says, no thank you.
What does he mean by blot your name out of your book that you have written?
I'm going to kill you.
Sorry.
I'm not really going to kill you. That's what it means. I'm not a violent person. It means you are going to be removed from the book of the living and placed into the book of the dead.
So that's not the book of life.
No. You're mixing cultures.
Okay.
Yeah, this is old stuff. And so it's not talking about like, I've lost my salvation or something like that. Here it's saying you are now going to be counted among who? The dead, not among the living. All right, believe it or not, we actually are approaching towards the end here. Okay, I am going to move quickly through some of this, and I probably should make it 2 videos. Whenever Moses, it says in Exodus 33, verses 8 through 11, whenever Moses went out of the tent, the people would rise up and watch. And Moses would enter the tent, and a pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance. And if you jump down a little bit farther, it says Moses would speak with the Lord face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. He joins a very small list here of Adam, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham. Here we see mankind is again a friend of God. This is what we're looking for. This is what we're hoping for there to be healing between the people of God and the God of the heavens. Exodus 34, verses 27 through 28 says this, "Write these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you in Israel." And so he was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, and he didn't eat any bread or drink any water. Can you think of somebody else who went up into the wilderness for 40 days and fasted? Why do you think Jesus was just like, it's been 40 days, I'm pretty tired, I'm going to go back now? No, it's purposeful. The parallels are not accidental. You're supposed to link them in your mind and see that God is drawing you a picture, showing you his goodness. He even does it with the priests that were serving in his temple. The priests were to make a robe, and it was really, really fancy. Lots of colors, lots of gemstones. And it says on the hem of their robe, they would hang pomegranates of blue and purple, and twined linen, and belts of pure gold, and put bells between the pomegranates and all around them. And so literally the priest was a walking picture of a garden. Wherever the priest went, you saw the fruit. You heard the music. You saw the colors. You're supposed to associate the tabernacle with the Eden which we had lost. And this is a step on the way back. It's going to ultimately find its fulfillment in Jesus. But it's visualized even here in the temple, the tabernacle. And so God cared how you acted in the tabernacle. He didn't want you to make a golden cow and say, this is the Lord. He didn't want you to dress your own way, act your own way, invent your own lines. And he shows this really clearly with two boys. They're not really boys, they're grown men, but they're the children of Aaron. It says they went into the tabernacle, Numbers chapter 3, verse 4. Nadab and Abihu, and they knelt down in front of the Holy of Holies, and they got to the altar of incense, and they burned strange fire before the Lord. And they died. They had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar served as the priests in the lifetime of Aaron, their father. This reminds me so much, again, of the two trees. They are in the garden, and they have to choose whether to do it God's way or to think, I'm going to do it this way. I think it's better. What happened when Adam and Eve did that in the garden? They died. Right? They got pushed out and they began death. What happened when these two guys, at the very gate of the Holy of Holies, did it? Same thing. How many of them were there? There were two. They did the exact same thing. It's as though we can't help ourselves from sinning and repeating the same patterns over and over again. For all of you poetry geeks out there, Moses' story comes complete with its own 7-line poem, just like Abraham's. It's only fair if Abraham gets one that Moses should get one. Actually, I guess it goes to Aaron. But it says, the Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. It's a little menorah of poetry, a blessing on God's people. As they get closer to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land, they find that there are giants in there, the children of Anak, and we can connect that back to the Genesis 6 stuff and what's going on there. But I want instead to focus on Numbers 13, 23 through 24. What is it that they bring out of the Holy Land? They cut down a what? Yeah, branch. Branches come off what? Trees. And what's this branch loaded down with? Grapes. And they carried it on a pole between two of them. And they brought pomegranates and figs. They said, you know what's over there? A garden. Beautiful place. So much food. Yeah, there's creepy, scary guys in there, the Anakim. But listen, our God is with us. They have to choose whether to do right or to do wrong. Remember the spies report, and there's two men who stand for righteousness, and the rest stand against. Can you see the illustration again? Of choosing right or choosing wrong. And they choose wrong. That's what we do best. That's what we do best. And they wander in the wilderness for how long? 40 years. While they are wandering around in the wilderness, I'm going to skip this verse. You can check that out on your own. I'm going to go right down to here. Chapter 14 and verse 4. I'm not really going to... I'll talk about it. It says they come from the Nephilim. There's giants again. Giants are enemies of God in the Bible. These aren't freakishly tall, 20-foot tall people, but these are giant clans. This connects back to Genesis 6. You can go read this again if you'd like. But I want to focus here because this becomes the heartbeat of their time in Egypt. Or not in Egypt, in the wilderness. Let's kill Moses and go back home. Where was home? The false Eden. Let's go back to Babel. Let's go back home. And time after time, God woos them back. And a couple times God says, stand back, Moses, I'm just going to wipe them out. And Moses talks God down. He says, you don't have to do that. And I think that's why God did it. God knew Moses would stand up for the people. It was an opportunity for Moses to intercede. But what we see happening here is that many times, one in particular, the punishment for their rebellion was fiery snakes that bite onto them. And how did they get healed from this? Do you remember? Yeah, there was a snake that they lifted up on a tree. And they said, look to this. Jesus quotes this in John chapter 3. Man, go study this stuff. By the way, if you haven't realized, I'm not breaking down all this stuff for you. I'm just trying to give you the main points so that you can go study on your own. But I want you to see the little odd nuggets so that you don't jump over them. The next day, this is Numbers 17, verse 8. Moses went into the tent, and behold, there, when they're trying to decide which of these guys is going to be the high priest, how does God tell Moses who the high priest is going to be? Well, he takes Aaron's staff, and what happens to it? It buds. It puts out shoots and flowers and almonds. It becomes a tree. It's not a stick anymore. It's a living tree. God is saying, where will the blessing that I bring to the people come from? It will come through Aaron. I have chosen him as my vessel. Where did the healing at Menorah come from? It came from God through the log that was thrown in there. Where did the Nile begin to bleed? Where the staffs. This is the picture that God is using. It is a picture of the goodness of God. Abraham was found beneath a tree. The sacrifice was found in the bush on top of the mount. Over and over again, we find trees and mountains that lead to gardens where we have to make a choice between right or between wrong. Story tells us that Miriam doesn't last much longer. Miriam dies. The whole congregation mourns. This is Numbers 20. And guess what happens? Right after Miriam dies, they realize that they're living in a place where there is no water. Again. You would think they would remember what happened last time. God just fixed it for us. This time, let's kill Moses and go back to Egypt. They do this all the time. This is what they want. And it says, would that we had perished with our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness that we should die here? both we and our cattle. And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Then it says, just jump down a little bit. It is no place for grain or figs, for vines or pomegranates. It said, there's no garden here. You've led us wrong. The glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water, so you shall bring water out of the rock for them to drink, and the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded them. Once again, God provides for rebellious people. We know how the story goes. Moses is losing family. He's tired. Things have been driving him nuts for years. And in the next couple chapters, he loses his brother. Numbers chapter 20. Verse 27. Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and they went up the mountain of Hor in the sight of all the congregation. And Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, and he put them on his son Eleazar. And Aaron did what? He died there on top of the mountain, and the people mourned. Why didn't they let him die in peace in his bed down at the foot of the mountain? With his clothes on. It goes back to the symbolism again. They wanted their brother, Moses wanted his brother to be close to the Lord. A place where they wouldn't be bothered, and he took him up high. This is an act of love. Just as when Jesus would walk up the mountain for us, it would be an act of love. The next person to pass away is Moses. And I think by this time he's ready for that. Larry, if you're watching this, I know you think it's a little sad that Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, but he's going to go directly into the real promised land. He doesn't get the short end of the stick here at all. He goes directly into what he has been hoping for, what Abraham was looking for. Jump all the way down here to the end. I'm going to show it to you here on the screen, and then I'm going to stop. There has not risen a prophet like Moses since, who the Lord knew face to face, and none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord did do in the land of Egypt. This is the last of an era. There will be no more Abraham, no more Isaac, no more Jacob, no more Noah. This is the end of the line. God has shown his glory in such a way that no one could mistake it, and mankind still eats from the wrong tree. So what do? That's what the rest of the Old Testament is about. But the story of Moses centers around the power of God and his deliverance of the people. It's a story about God's faithfulness and about how he can change and use anyone. But over and over again, it shows us that we have to make a choice, and that the only path that leads to life is to eat from the tree of life, to serve God and not to serve ourselves. I'm going to go ahead and end this here and stop the video. And I hope that, I'm sure I've lost like 90% of the people who are out there, and that's okay. But I'm going to answer the questions of the people who are here. If you guys have questions, you can go ahead and post them. God bless you guys. And Jeff, whenever you would just push the button and I'll wave awkward.